Lecarde Chronicles 2 is a fan-made Castlevania game developed by the two-man team known as Fangame. For over a decade, these guys have made some of the best Castlevania titles in years, starting with their two unofficial Haunted Castle sequels, before moving on to this original series starring Ephraim Lecarde. Each new entry throughout the years has been better than the last, and all of their hard work has culminated in this, the Lecarde Chronicles 2. An ambitious, grandiose adventure that has quickly become one of my favorite Castlevania games to date. Before we get started, I'd like to suggest that you watch our review of the first Lecarde Chronicles if you haven't, since I'll be referencing that one a fair amount here. There's a lot to unpack when it comes to this thing, so you could almost consider this the second installment of a two-part review. With that out of the way, let's get crackin'. Straight out of the gate, I was a pretty big fan of the first Lecarde Chronicles, despite the few issues I had with it. Back in the 90s, when console developers were hyping the releases of their newest 32-bit machines, I always wanted my favorite 8 and 16-bit series to stay in the 2D style, with larger adventures and sharper graphics. Instead, we were mostly given jagged, ugly polygonal games with janky controls and terrible camera angles. Sure, there were a few out there that I dug, but by and large I wasn't a fan of that generation of gaming, even at the time. However, a few series had entries that tickled my fancy. Mega Man had a classic installment with its 8th entry. We got the sexy looking X4, and of course, the surprisingly good Castlevania Symphony of the Night. I've said this before in nearly every other Castlevania video I've made, but in retrospect, I'm not as big a fan of Symphony of the Night as most. I bought it at launch and loved it as I felt like it was a beautiful 2D oasis in a desert of disgustingly hideous 3D games. It was colorful, intricate, and addictive. I'd be lying if I said I didn't return to it time and time again, but the overall art style of all of these games has never really appealed to me. This isn't a slight against Ayami Kojima's beautifully detailed designs, but the anime style has never done it for me when it comes to this series. I'm glad they exist and I've had a lot of fun with all of them, but I've always wished that Konami would have produced some classic Vania titles alongside them. What we got with the first Lecarde Chronicles was a massive re-envisioned version of those early Castlevania games. Players were given a map and a few choices, but it mostly played out like a bigger level-to-level affair. The art style was also a return to form with an amalgamation of the barbaric style of the originals paired with swaths of anime tinge. Sure, the characters all looked a bit stiff and clunky in motion, but the backgrounds were mostly dark and gothic. It's a superb game overall, but it lacked in a few areas. Stairs were a nightmare to traverse. The music was great but executed in a sloppy way, and there were a couple tiny areas that felt needlessly difficult just for the sake of it. Overall though, I loved it, and it ranks as one of my favorites in the entire series, warts and all. Fast forward 4 years to 2017 and Megami would give us their Castlevania magnum opus. This one, the Lecarde Chronicles 2. The stairs are no longer an issue, the music is executed a bit more seamlessly, and the controls can now be set in the options menu without the need for joy to key with a modern controller. So far so good. Ephraim still looks like a rigid cardboard cutout, and his design is somehow a little less appealing, at least in my opinion. Instead of his red garb, he is now dressed in something that looks like a skirt made up of carelessly patched up potato sacks, but his appearance doesn't matter much because this game just feels... it just feels really fucking good, man. Plus, I mean, every time he climbs a rope, I question my sexuality. Hey girl, where'd you come from? Oh, it's still you, huh, Ephraim? Oh my lord, God have mercy. Get up that rope. Shimmy your way All of his upgrades from the first game get stripped from the get-go, which is a trope that I've admittedly gotten a bit tired of over the years, and his whip has now been mysteriously switched to an Lecarde style blade. If the first game was a stage-to-stage adventure in the same vein of the classic 8 and 16-bit titles, then this sequel is something a lot closer to the Metroid-style outings. There's a fair amount of Simon's Quest in here too, which is one of my personal favorites on the NES. Structurally, the first 3/5 of the game see Ephraim going back and forth from town to mansion in an effort to take out some big bads, similarly to that second 8-bit outing. There are tons of areas to explore and a lot of puzzles to solve. At first, I wasn't a huge fan of these changes. I really enjoyed the straightforward, mostly linear design of the first, but after an hour or so, things really started to click and I got into a rhythm. There's a map now, directly ripped from Symphony of the Night, but I barely referenced it until I got to the latter portion of the game. It wasn't until I realized that this adventure is basically broken up into levels, similarly to its predecessor, that I started to really get into it. Like I said, it's similar to Simon's Quest at the beginning, but without any of the obtuse nonsense. As Lecarde, you'll be bouncing back and forth from one town to the next, hitting up smaller dungeons, caverns, and mansions along the way to pick up goods and upgrades in order to unlock the major castle set piece. To say that all of this is well designed would be a massive understatement. For my money, and I've given this a lot of thought, this is the best exploration through challenging platforming and puzzle design I've ever experienced in any Castlevania game. Zero hyperbole. It is truly flawless. Plus, I mean, come on, here, look at this. Oh boy. Back and forth, you filthy paper bag prince. I think the best way to describe the beginning of this game is that it feels like you're exploring the world from Simon's Quest with tiny, bite-sized Symphony of the Night dungeons sprinkled throughout. It's pretty brilliant. This time around, there are generous amounts of save points, but they are distributed thoughtfully. Traversing a new area is always a bit stressful since you never know if you're on the right path or where the next checkpoint is. Yes, there are plenty, but they are all meticulously placed in such a way that Ephraim and his beautiful hips will be thankful for each and every one. There are shortcuts leading back to these points in a style that I like to call the Firelink Shrine Syndrome. It's tiresome to compare everything to Dark Souls, and yes, I understand that. In all honesty, I can't really think of a better way to describe the feeling. For those who don't watch my live streams on Twitch, the Firelink Shrine thing is that wet feeling you get in your pants after you've completely gone off the beaten path, fought your way through some challenges, and arrived back to a previous checkpoint unexpectedly. It's that wonderful feeling to get back to that safe place, coupled with the knowledge that you've busted open a once indestructible wall or found a path that enables quick access to more areas. It's clever, it's sexy, it's Firelink Shrine. All of these shortcuts are creative and make the world much more enjoyable to explore. Also, there are warp points strewn across the entire world this time, which makes for a very easy game to navigate. None of these things are new to these Metroid-style games, but the challenge in the Lecarde Chronicles 2 is much more of a hurdle than any of the something Castlevania games. This is why I compare it to Dark Souls rather than any of the games it is directly inspired by. You know, as much as I hate having to be that guy who sees the souls in everything. Alright, so back on track, I guess. As I said before, the first half or so is structured in a particular way, but there's a point where the castle doors unlock and this thing turns into a proper EGA-era Castlevania. Like, just go balls in, here we go, one giant environment to explore all at once. And again, it's better than the majority of the official titles because this set piece takes up the entire final half of the game. In 2018, Sabotage Studios released The Messenger, which got a lot of hype for doing this exact same thing. But you know what? I'm sorry, eat your heart out, Messenger, because Megami did it first. And hey, this castle is no joke. It will be putting the player to the test. The platforming is tough, but tight. Like those sweet, sexy, salty buns are shimmy, 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 shimmy. There are also a lot of really clever puzzles. The difference between this one and its predecessor is that Lecarde has options this time around to refill his life and use spells. There are health potions available from shopkeepers as well as just lying around in the environment, but there's a limit to how much Ephraim can carry, which really works to keep the challenge level high. You can't just guzzle them over and over. The game requires a bit of item management and skill to overcome its more difficult sections. This time, enemies cause different afflictions such as poison and curse, so keeping a few potions on hand for those as well is necessary. Playing carelessly is very punishing, and there will be more than a handful of times where you'll find yourself just hemorrhaging health if you're not paying attention to your status effects. It's tough but fair, and I rarely saw the game over screen outside of a few boss encounters, but I also took things very slowly and methodically on my first few playthroughs. Speaking of the big bads, I feel a bit awful admitting this, but the majority of them are just kinda okay. It's really hard for me to say anything negative about this game as I've now played through it over and over and I love it, but sadly the bosses are mostly just static images at times that fire projectiles around the screen. Basically it all comes down to avoiding the shots, smashing them when an opening is available, rinse, and repeat. They have very limited patterns and the majority look like clip art images. There are a few that are well animated, but for the most part they are pretty disappointing. I also found some of them unbalanced. A few late game ones are a bit of a pushover, while others take up so much screen real estate that they can be a chore to dodge or hit. I really wanted to like them, but sadly, they are the game's biggest weakness. It's one area where I think Megami did a better job in the first Lecarde Chronicles. Another addition to this one is this sort of magic system that enables Ephraim to charge up a collected aura in order to buff himself. There are different variations of these that can be charged up, ranging from offensive perks to defensive. To be honest, I found these a bit cumbersome to activate at first, since the game does a pretty poor job at introducing them to the player. In the latter portions of the castle, some of these are necessary in order to take down some of the bosses. It's a unique system, but sometimes I found it tough to highlight the aura that I wanted to use, as it cycles through the variants quite quickly while the button is being held down. Utilizing the trigger buttons on the controller to toggle these might have been a better solution, but what's here isn't exactly bad. It's just a little finicky to master. I mean, at least it was for me. All of the moves return from the first entry, including the spinny weapon thingy, though this time it has been nerfed substantially to make it less of a get-out-of-jail-free card. This was a good change, since a lot of the bosses in the original Lecarde Chronicles were pretty trivial if the player knew how to master this move efficiently by conserving hearts. There are a lot more weapons to fill out Ephraim's arsenal as well, with most having attack ranges similar to those of Alucard's from Symphony. Also, Alucard is Dracula spelled backwards, and Mario 2 wasn't supposed to be a Mario game at all. These weapons are different variations of swords and axes, similarly to its official main series brethren. There are different forms of headgear, outfits, and other trinkets that the player will have to swap out depending on the scenario. Almost all of them are useful, but none of them alter the appearance of Ephraim in-game, which is a massive pet peeve of mine, though I do enjoy watching him shimmy up those ropes, so maybe it's for the best that he remains in his brownie browns. Speaking of Alucard, which is Dracula spelled backwards for those who have forgotten, Robert Belgrade has returned from Symphony of the Night to lend his voice to the returning character, as well as to narrate cutscenes. They're as stiff and awkward as ever, but I wouldn't have it any other way. There are a few secrets, at least one more unlockable playable protagonist, and multiple endings for those who want to dig deep and explore all of this game's nooks and crannies. I'm not going to spoil any of this stuff though, since they are all part of the fun, and messing around in this world is extremely rewarding from start to finish. Jeffrey Montoya's music is superb, with a lot of tracks taken from classic Castlevania titles. The majority of them are piano-driven, which really adds to the overall art style presented by the sole developer, Mig Perez. A nice touch is how the tunes change depending on the time of day, while still managing to stick with a consistent melody or theme. The enemies and environments are also altered slightly, with some towns being locked down and swarming with monsters at night. Again, similarly to Simon's Quest. It's a technical marvel and an impressive feat that all of these environments were largely created by one man. As goofy as some of the character animations are, the environments are varied, well designed, and gorgeous, with some excellent parallax scrolling and tiny illustrated details all around. The Lecarde Chronicles 2 is a masterpiece that I haven't yet got bored of playing. It's as long and as hard as I get whenever I watch Ephraim climb those old, filthy Game Boy style ropes. As a fan of everything Castlevania, I've played a ton of fan games, and this one is by far the best. If Konami ever decided to get their heads out of their collective asses, I'd like to see them pay this man for his hard work. Is it really that hard to get someone with this amount of pure love on board to provide something this meaningful? The amount of effort that went into this thing is noticeable on every screen and with each re-envisioned piece of music. This is such a sexy Castlevania experience that I urge all of you fans to download it immediately. And wear protection, because those hips are dangerous.